Long, long ago, in the ancient times of 2021, we saw the first attempt at bringing Rust support into the kernel. RFC Rust support. RFC meaning request for comment. This was being done through the Rust for Linux project. Now, at the time, there was a lot of feedback on the patch set, and that really hasn't changed since then. But at the time, it definitely needed that feedback because it was not ready for upstream. It wasn't even ready for an RFC. This shouldn't have been anywhere near the Linux kernel because Rust's biggest benefit is all of the whole memory safety stuff over C. But it was doing stupid things like if you ran out of memory, it would just throw a panic and abort. That should never happen at the kernel level. It's fine in user space, but the kernel is a different beast. With the main point of Rust being safety, there is no way I will ever accept panic dynamically, whether due to out of memory or due to anything else. I also reacted to the floating point use cases dynamic panics as a feature in the Rust model. Now, this is what you expect from a very early RFC. Things don't usually get merged straight away. Things have to be redone to fit into the kernel. And that's exactly what happened. After that original RFC, there were 10 different versions of the patch set sent out to the kernel, all trying to get reviewed, all trying to get merged, all getting a lot of feedback before finally being ready to merge in the 6.1 window. But this was still very early days. What existed at the time was effectively the Hello World version of this infrastructure. It was not ready for full-on drivers yet. That was still going to come way later down the line as little bits and pieces get merged, as various different projects need to make use of the Rust infrastructure. As is often going to be the case in a big, long-running project with maintainers who've been in the project for, in some cases, 30 or so years, there are people who are very for and very against these changes. Yes, Linus Torvalds did accept the merger into the Linux kernel, and at the end of the day, his word is law. But different subsystems have their own sort of independence. They can choose to make use of things and choose to not, and it's not being accepted by all subsystems, and some of the subsystems are a little bit more against it than others. Let's talk about the recent Rust drama. Wedson retiring from the Rust for Linux project. Now, Wedson has basically been involved in it from the start. He's been a very big driving force in actually making it happen, putting a lot of effort into the project, is one of the de facto leaders of the project. This is not something that happened because of a one-off interaction, a one-off bad conversation. This is something that has been built up over all of this time working on the Rust for Linux project. This is as short a series as one can be. Just removing myself as maintainer of the Rust for Linux project. I am retiring from the project after almost 4 years. I find myself lacking the energy and enthusiasm I once had to respond to some of the non-technical nonsense, so it's best to leave it up to those who still have it in them. To the Rust for Linux team, thank you, you were great. It was a pleasure working with you all. The times we spent discussing technical issues, finding ways to address soundness holes, etc. was something I always enjoyed and looked forward to. I count myself lucky to have collaborated with such a talented and friendly group. I just noticed a spelling mistake there. I didn't spot that one before. I wish all the success to the project. I truly believe the future of kernels is with memory-safe languages. I am no visionary, but if Linux doesn't internalize this, I'm afraid some other kernel would do it what it did to Unix. Lastly, I'll leave a small 3-minute 30 sample of context here. And to reiterate, no one is trying to force anyone to learn Rust, nor prevent refactorings of C code. A lot of people saw this clip and assumed this was the entire reason this happened. It's not, but it serves as a good example. Most notably, this part right here. So let's just have a quick
So we're not trying to
listen.
enforce new ways of specific ways of doing things. We're encoding how things are done in the I get locked example here. right? That's
This is
what I'm
early
saying.
days. We're not trying to boil the ocean here.
Yeah, we're almost out of time here, and
This who you're listening to is Ted So, who is a very prolific kernel maintainer. This is the part that a lot of people got very annoyed by.
I suspect part of the problem here
More specifically, the people who really care about Rust got very annoyed by.
is you're trying to convince everyone to switch over to the religion as promulgated by Rust. And the reality is that ain't going to happen because we have 50 plus file systems in Linux. They will not all be instantaneously converted over to Rust. Before that happens, we will continue to refactor C code because we want to make the C code better. If it breaks the Rust...
Just pay attention to these speakers as he's talking. Like, they just want to get a word in. He's not letting it happen.
Bindings, at least for the foreseeable future, the Rust bindings are a second-class citizen, and those file systems that depend on the Rust bindings will break, and that is the Rust bindings problem, not the file system community at large problem. And that's going to be true for a long, long time.
Okay.
And I think we just simply need to accept that,
Yeah.
right? Because the answer, you are not allowed to refactor to the C code because it would break 5 critical file
As I said, they're like, let me talk. Let me just respond to what you're saying.
systems that distros depend upon is like not
But
a
that wasn't the
starter.
answer.
Okay? So like, we'll see. I suspect the best thing to do is you to continue maintaining your Rust bindings. Over time, there will be continued C code refactoring, right? Maybe we will start using, K-free RCU. If that breaks Rust, we will find out whether or not this concept of encoding huge amounts of semantics into the type system is a good thing or a bad thing. And instead of trying to convince us what is actually correct, let's see what happens in a year or two. And it will either work or it won't. And we will see, more likely, where does the pain get allocated? Because with most of these sort of engineering things, it's almost always a pain allocation question.
So Ted, let me try to respond to that. I'm not saying that C is going to be stuck in whatever it has. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is I want for you guys to tell me what the semantics are of these things that will reflect in Rust. That's all I'm saying.
More semantics you encode, the more fragile you make the Rust ecosystem.
No.
But wait, but the fragility, from my point of view, is the same of any user, right? Users of these APIs, they have to know about the semantics and they have to use them, right? And the rule is, if you make a change, a semantic change, you have to go and fix everybody else who you have broken.
Here's
right?
the big... Here's the real big part.
While Rust is a second-class citizen, I'm fine for you guys to say we don't care about this. You guys should
Here's
look at
the
it.
thing. You're not going to force all of us to learn Rust. If I make a change, I will fix all of the C code because that's my responsibility. Because I don't know Rust, I'm not going to fix the Rust bindings. Sorry.
Ted, let me try to say it more clearly. I'm not trying to force you or anybody else to do anything else, right? I'm just asking politely to see if you guys could give us semantic information. That's all I'm asking.
Guys,
This is such a great argument. I absolutely love it. Okay, let me explain what was going on here. If you want to have Rust bindings in a project, C bindings in a project, Java bindings, Python bindings, anything else, these don't just magically happen. These need to be written and these need to be maintained. Now, from the Rust perspective, they want to have the semantic information of how these functions should be used so they can encode that information into the function signature itself. So this makes it a lot clearer how to actually make use of these functions, how to interact with the kernel, and this is one of the benefits of a language like Rust that often doesn't get discussed, because right now, a lot of the kernel documentation is kind of just like, not really there, and you got to examine the source code to know things like, does this function accept a null? Does it accept the negative value? If it accepts a negative value, does a negative value actually mean something special? You can encode a lot of this information into Rust and make it a lot easier to work with things. Now, from the C side, they don't want to have to deal with Rust because, well, they're C developers and they don't know Rust. So they see these Rust bindings as really fragile because if they go and refactor a function signature, all of a sudden, that Rust binding is now completely broken, and they don't want to have to go and maintain a thing that they don't have the knowledge of, that they probably are going to make mistakes on as well, and they feel like there's going to be a lot of additional pain that is being allocated around to people who just don't want to have to deal with it. There are a lot of people very heated on both sides of this discussion, and I think the part being often forgotten is both sides make a really good point. The C people are making a good point about making these functions easy to use, encoding how the function should be used into the function itself. The C people make a really good point about these functions being really fragile and the pain not really being clear where it's going to be allocated. And it's one of those often cases where things honestly could probably be resolved if people just sat down and talk to each other. Not making hot takes on Twitter and Mastodon, not going and talking shit about people without really thinking about their perspective, not strawmanning anyone else's argument, sitting down, better yet if you can, in person, talking, if not over a video call, and just try to understand what the other person is saying, try to come to a reasonable conclusion here, try to come to a reasonable middle ground. Since that is not happening, I would like to highlight a couple of statements that various people involved have put out. The first one being from Asahi Lina. A subset of C kernel developers just seem determined to make the lives of Rust maintainers as difficult as possible. They don't see Rust as having value and would rather it just goes away. When I tried to upstream the DRM abstractions last year, that was all blocked on basic support for the concept of a device in Rust. Even just a stub wrapper for a struct device would be enough. That simple concept only finally recently got merged over 1 year later. When I wrote the DRM scheduler abstractions, I ran into many memory safety issues caused by bad design of the underlying C code. The lifetime requirements were undocumented and boiled down to design your driver like AMD GPU and make it work, or else. My driver is not like AMD GPU. It fundamentally can't work the same way. When I tried to upstream minor fixes to the C code to make the behavior more robust and lifetime requirements sensible, the maintainer blocked it and said I should just do what other drivers do. Even when I pointed out that other C drivers also trigger the same bugs because the API is just bad and unintuitive and there are many secret hidden lifetime requirements, he wouldn't budge. One C driver works, so Rust drivers must work the same way. Next, we have Jeremy Soller of System76, a big engineer in the Cosmic project, and also the lead developer of RedoxOS, a system entirely built around Rust. Rust applications, Rust desktop, Rust kernel, everything is Rust. This kind of treatment is exactly why I started Redox from scratch and written primarily in Rust. There is a lot of resistance to even minor beneficial change in Linux and related projects. I don't even try to contribute to the Linux kernel anymore. There are projects where you'll inevitably have to get your changes past patronizing pedantic megalomaniacs, and while the Linux kernel is not only developed by this personality type, it is overwhelmingly controlled by it. I have no fond memories of submitting patches there, whereas I find contributing to most Rust projects to be downright delightful. Next is Ludpool, an Xorg Foundation board member, Mesa, Wayland, and upstream Linux kernel developer. Okay, actually serious post about Rust for Linux now, no more kissy. There is something I realized just now I should be saying in the midst of all this debate. I don't think the majority of people in the kernel are bad, far from it. I literally wouldn't be here if I thought that. The people I've worked with in this community are genuinely some of the nicest people I've met and are incredibly skilled at what they do. So understand, when I'm talking about Linux and the problems, I really am doing so because I think it's all going to burn down or it's always like this. I'm concerned, yes. It's about interactions that define how people see the kernel at large I'm concerned about. This isn't just for DRM either. I should specify DRM when we're talking about the Linux kernel is Direct Rendering Manager, not Digital Rights Management. While I think DRM is honestly kind of really on top of a lot of stuff in ways I wish the rest of the kernel was, but it's not like I'm going into other kernel communities and fighting an endless war or something like that. I promise I literally wouldn't have the energy in me to even do that if I wanted to, but it can be really difficult to talk about the problems I've seen without coming across as such because so often minor problems can lead to big backlash, not just in public reception, but also in how people who ran into said problems actually feel about things overall. It can be really easy to forget this too when a lot of social issues tend to be like this. So much of public relations has less to do with direct fact versus direct impact. One person in a crowd of people can still define the way that entire crowd is viewed, so long as they hold some level of influence there and have a voice. It can be illogical, but at the end of the day, the end result is usually the only thing that makes a difference. It is Plato's cave. If the only source of information you can get is negative, it might as well be a fact. Not only that, but just like in the cave, if someone escapes from it and sees the person making the shadow puppets, they may just not believe it. They can go back in the cave and the shadows are still there. Here is Carol Herbst, a Mesa and Novo developer. Maybe at some point, I should talk about some of the pushback I've gotten when I proposed Rustical to be merged into Mesa. But all in all, I think we can safely say that introducing Rust to Mesa as a success. I don't know how much that impacted Faith Extran writing Knack in Rust, but at least I've dealt with some of the Meson and Rust integration problems early on, so at least I enabled that to be a bit simpler than if I hadn't done that. Carol's take here is just generally about working with Rust, but he has been reposting a lot of the other takes we've seen before, so it's pretty clear what his stance in the situation is. And Dave Ailey wrote an entire blog post about the different kinds of people you'll run into in the kernel, the different kinds of interactions you're going to have, and honestly, like, this article just by itself kinda deserves to be an entire video. I'll leave it linked down below if you want to properly read it. But of course, not everyone is in favor of the Rust stuff. If there's someone like Ted So who is saying stuff like this publicly, there are other people that are going to have issues as well. One of them that Lena highlighted is this post from Jason Gunthorpe. If the ship has already sailed, then we really need someone like Linus and Co to stand up and clearly say those words to everyone and repeat it a few times. I think there is a sizable contingent that does not believe that to be the case, and Ted's remarks of effectively wanting nothing to do with Rust are not unique or unreasonable given the cloudy situation. I know enough people betting on the failure of this experiment. In my honest opinion, the current situation of Rust does not look like success. It is basically unusable except for unmerged toy projects, and it is still not obvious when that will change. Can we rely on Red Hat 10 kernel having full baseline Rust support? If yes, then in 4 years, maybe the server/enterprise industry could actually take Rust seriously. Can Rust even support the OOT backporting stuff everyone does? Is there a strong enough preprocessor? What is the situation with Android? Can an Android device vendor write a driver in Rust today? I've pondered if I should consider Rust for some of the greenfield projects I've done recently, IO MMUFD in Rust, generic PT, but at the end of the day, that work is being paid for by people who intend to backport it to old kernels. I can't write it in Rust and meet that need. I bet a lot of people are in the same boat. The reason why Lena got annoyed with this is, one of those toy projects that he was talking about was her GPU driver, which is not a toy project. It's very far from that. Now, he did slightly change his wording here to say, yes, AGX, really cool project, amazing software, but it doesn't change the fact that AGX is unmerged and serves a tiny niche user base with no commercial relevance. That is an unmerged toy by my definition. Lena, again, disagrees here wherever you can find her comment because tons of people commented here. There are a lot of people who are interested in what work she is doing. There is a lot of commercial interest here. It's just not the same people who are interested in what Rel is doing. This thread has basically all of the faces here. We have Keys Cook, a prolific kernel developer. We have Jonathan Corbett, who is the maintainer of LWN. We have a bunch of other people like Joshua Ashton, Dave Ailey, Neil Gomper, because Neil's everywhere, as I've established before. Like, if you want to just see basically a bit of everything here, again, I can't read the entire thread here. It's just way too big. And as he tends to do, Drew DeVault also had, I'm not going to say a take on this, because for about 3 days, it was the only thing he was talking about, basically posting every hour or so. A motivated group of Rust developers could build a production-ready, mostly Linux-compatible kernel from scratch within 5 years without doing any politics on LKML. Passionate 3 to 4 person hobby OSs have achieved impressive levels of Linux compatibility very quickly. Pour the level of enthusiasm that Rust in Linux has into a greenfield project to build a Linux-compatible kernel, and you would have astonishing gains very quickly. I think there needs to be some time to heal, but the Rust in Linux folks should really rally around a new Linux-compatible kernel project from scratch. It'd be wild. It would actually work, whereas Rust in Linux is still a huge gamble and a burnout machine. Rust would be a really good fit for a big Linux-style monolithic kernel, and they could realize a lot of gains very, very quickly, in my opinion. Not a great fit when retrofitted into the Linux establishment. Up until that point, keeping things pretty tame, and then, as Drew tends to do, one person ticks him off, and then he goes on a psycho rant. And he also wrote a blog post about this, pretty much saying a lot of the same stuff he said in his many tweet threads. There is just one part I do want to highlight in here though. Rust is a great fit for a large monolithic kernel design like Linux. Imagine having the opportunity to implement something like dcache from scratch in Rust without engaging with the politics. That's something a small group of people, perhaps as few as one, could make substantial inroads on in a short period of time, taking full advantage of what Rust has to offer. A lot of people on the Rust side are not saying his name, but it's very obvious who they're talking about when they say, oh, some big Linux name, some big Linux blogger is talking about how Rust people should go and make their own kernel and not be involved in Linux. I understand why they're annoyed by this take, because what he's effectively saying is, don't get involved in the kernel that people are actually using, go and make some educational project, go and make some toy project that nobody actually cares to use. Maybe if you encourage some big company to work on it with you, it'll get some adoption, but going and trying to make your own kernel is not going to have any real adoption for a very, very long time. Redux is a great example of this. Redux is a great project, but it's very much still an educational, experimental project. This is not a situation that's going to end tomorrow, in a couple of days, in a couple of weeks, a couple of months. This is something that is going to have to be dealt with if people actually want Rust to be in the kernel. Now, I do like Rust. I think having Rust in the kernel is going to be beneficial. I just want to make that clear. But you can't just go ahead and keep being in this situation where a lot of the maintainers, some of the maintainers, very big maintainers will say, don't want it to be here. These problems have to be sorted out because it's only going to get worse from here. So far, to the best of my knowledge, Linus Torvalds hasn't yet made a statement on the situation. I'd be very surprised if there weren't some behind closed doors discussions. I don't know if he's going to make an official statement, if he's just going to talk about random things on Linux kernel mailing list. If he does say something, I'm absolutely going to talk about the response as well. Linus is the BDFL. He agreed to bring Rust into the kernel. He now has to accept the fact that he has to deal with this problem. Is he going to take it out of the kernel? Is he going to tell people to fall in line and deal with it? I don't know what his response is going to be, but I feel like he really needs to say something. Now, someone who did say something is Wedson, the guy who retired from the Rust for Linux project, in a comment to the Register. When I started on this project, I fully expected we would get pushback on technical grounds, and I was willing to work under that assumption that eventually we would find consensus. Almost 4 years into this, I expected we would be past tantrums from respected members of the Linux kernel community. I just ran out of steam to deal with them, as I said in my email. If it isn't obvious, the gentleman yelling in the mic that I won't force them to learn Rust is Ted So, but there are others. This is just one example that is recorded and readily available. I've heard in the past from several maintainers that they're just overburdened and don't have time for anything else. I'm sympathetic to their plight. Those who can't or don't want to be involved are obviously welcome to stay away. This does not and did not bother me at all. The team has been setting the groundwork for new components/drivers to be written in Rust, but as these are developed, we're running into some roadblocks. Torvalds doesn't seem to care, or perhaps believes they are appropriate. Time will tell. Ultimately, I don't know how this is going to play out. If you want to know my opinion here, I think that the Rust people are making a good point. I do think this is going to be a lot of work to make it work, but I think in the long run, having these Rust bindings here, having this encoded into the actual function signature, having this be something that is just accepted in the kernel is probably going to be a good thing. It's not going to be without work, it's not going to be without a lot of work, but in the long run, if they don't do it, I don't know what's going to happen. But let me know your thoughts down below. If you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, LiberaPay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and give me all of your programming language wars in the description, in the comments, because I know you're going to do so anyway. I don't even need to prompt you for it.
Something like this.